I'm Audrey, and this is Martha. I'd like to start by pointing out that along with Anabaso in Europe, I believe, Martha, that you are probably the preeminent person, the preeminent figure in aphasia rehabilitation worldwide. And it's really delightful to have this opportunity to have this talk with you. And in getting ready for it, I've prepared a series of questions that I've shared with Martha. There aren't surprises here. That have both a looking forward quality to them and a looking back quality. And I don't know whether we're going to get through all of these, because Martha and I have been doing a lot of talking in the last couple of days, and we've been having a wonderful time doing it, and we've digressed all over the place. So we don't know whether we're going to get through all of this. But I confess, as I got these questions ready, I tried to answer them myself. And part of my answers, I was surprised at how many times I said, duh, I don't know. I don't know what the answer to this is. I wish I knew. But I have a feeling that Martha might have a handle on some of them that I really don't have a handle on.
I think so.
I want to make this an enjoyable experience for the audience, but I think it's more important to make it a nice experience for us. So help us to have some fun up here.
Yes.
And I intend to stop the session. Or has asked us to go on for 40 minutes. But we'll try to stop the session early enough so that you have a chance to ask some other questions that might occur to you in the course of this talk. So please keep that in mind as we go along. And I want to start by saying about, I guess it was in 2000, that we were part of the launch, the inauguration of Connect, the Connect program in London. And Martha gave the final speech at that meeting. She gave this incredible talk with a real moral imperative for a psychosocial agenda for people with aphasia. And I really want to begin by asking you to, I hate to do this to you, summarize a talk you gave 7 years ago, but can you give us the flavor of that talk again?
Well, I'll try. I did not go back to it to see what was in it at the time, but I think I recall. It was organized in such a way that I was leading up to, in this presentation, to the fact that I thought that speech pathologists in particular had a moral obligation, an ethical moral obligation, as long as they had taken on this population of aphasics, as long as they considered that part of their scope of practice, that they had an enormous commitment and moral obligation to provide these individuals as a group and as individuals with aphasia who, with whatever it takes to give them a life that was worthwhile living. And that incorporates much more than looking at the impairment and just working with the language deficiencies, that it takes a very skilled person and a very real human being to be able to get inside another human being's world. But I think that that's what it takes. And that is, I think, our challenge, to meet that moral imperative, as long as we've made this commitment to work with this population. I think that was essentially it, though I covered a lot of other things in the same talk.
That was the essential moral imperative, and I don't think that's changed. I don't think we've have retreated from it in the last 7 years.
No.
Okay. Before I get to some of the questions we prepared, I'm kind of curious to hear about the research you're doing. I mean, you have continued to do research throughout your professional career, which has predominantly been clinical and administrative, with this glorious thread of research running through it. So, can you just kind of summarize that?
Well, almost all of my research has addressed psychosocial issues in one way or another, particularly quality of life concerns. And in the last 20 years, or 15 to 20 years, I've focused very much on looking at what might happen across time. And I'm very concerned with the time factor, because patients are so different in the early days from from the way they appeared or the way they are at the end of the first year, beginning of the second year, that I have done some studies that have looked at quality of life and functional communication and language change in large groups of aphasics who've been very carefully selected. In two of these studies, and both of which have not been published, one of them is in the works but not quite finished. The results showed very strongly that if one addresses quality of life issues and if one addresses functional communication in very real ways, using groups, using interactions that are not the traditional interactions at all, if one plans around exposure and conversational opportunities and social opportunities for people with aphasia of all severities, from the very most global patients to both fluent and non-fluent patients who are mild, that what one yields is a person who is far more comfortable, a person who's more confident, more able to get on with his life, more able to deal with enjoying what there is of life, and seeing, as Mr. Rico so beautifully said, to be able to see the world and experience the music and experience and I forget her name, but the lady who read the wonderful poem of her creation, that she was able to enjoy her world. This most recent study, which I'm hoping to have a paper for very soon, is very, very strong. We saw 86 patients over a 3-year period who had had some speech therapy. Most of them had had up to 6 months. And then we worked with them in groups and individually with a focus on life, on living. And we saw them for periods of 16 weeks. And we had a caregiver component to this program as well, working with the caregivers to teach them and train them in what we were doing so that they could participate in the process. It was a very successful program. I'm sorry that it ended, but funding is what it is, and it did have to end. It went on for 3 years, but it was a repeat of another study that preceded it. And the findings in quality of life on functional life measures, as well as on functional communication, were significant statistically. The findings on linguistic measures were not. So that was a very pleasing study to finish.
Thank you for catching us up so we're ahead of the press on that. As I said earlier, Martha and I have been chattering in the bus for the last 2 days, and chattering about all sorts of things, and I've learned a lot about Martha in the last few days. And one of the things that was not in my list of questions, but I really, again, think is really an important one for Martha to share with you is, how did you get into this business in the first place?
It was very much by accident. I was not a good student, and it was a few years after the war had ended that I was in journalism, and then I moved to philology, and then I moved back to journalism again. Very disgruntled student at Michigan State University, Jackie Hinckley's alma mater. And there wasn't such a thing as speech-language pathology at that time. It simply didn't exist. You should know that when I graduated, there were 1,100 members of ASHA. There are now 125,000, so it has grown a little bit. It was a very different time, and it was a time of tumult and confusion. You know, the war had ended, and these men were coming back, and it was just I don't think it's anything you can imagine. You would have had to have lived through it. But I was a very unhappy camper, as we say. And I was from New York, and I was in the wrong culture. I'm not a Middle Westerner at all. And I was just feeling very strange. And someone said, since you're interested in words and sounds and writing, why don't you look into this thing at the time called speech correction? because they're going to start a program here that might be interesting. Well, there were 5 of us who had the same interest, and we graduated together eventually. It was a very lovely experience, and it really turned me on. It really engaged me completely. I think partly because the lady who ran it was a lady from Louisiana who was the daughter of a neurologist, and she brought neurology to the classroom, and it was very alive, and it really impressed me. And she also brought the notion of the patient as person, and that really impressed me too. And we, the 5 of us, went in different directions after graduation. This was not a time when people went on for a master's degree and then went on for a Ph.D. That was not the course of action at all, as it is for all of you, or has been for all of you. When I came back to New York to work, I really didn't know where to turn, because there was no such thing as a speech pathologist in a medical setting or a speech pathologist in a school setting. There were speech correctionists in the public schools, but that was not my take on what I wanted to do at all. And through a connection, and I must say, strictly a connection, and this was entirely accidental, I had an appointment made for me with Dr. Rusk, who didn't mean a thing to me at the time. My father worked at the New York Times, and so that was the connection. And he hired me for this new thing that he was doing called rehabilitation medicine. The medical specialty had just become a boarded specialty 2 years before. It didn't exist before that. And he was the kingpin, the father. He became the father of rehabilitation medicine, and has always been referred to that way, in this movement, which he had brought with him from his Army days, having experienced very successful treatments of paraplegic patients, and having connected himself to some New York philanthropists who wanted to start rehabilitation medicine services in New York City. So he chaired a new department in the School of Medicine at NYU, the Rehabilitation Medicine Department, and and he brought in various people to work with him. And it's to his greatness to note that he included speech therapy, which was then called, as a part of his program. Given the fact that, and you must understand that stroke patients did not exist in such civilian institutions at that time. The only aphasics who were being seen were Army veterans, and they were being seen in Army hospitals mostly. I'm talking too much.
No, keep going.
Anyway,
don't worry.
I was very young and very green. I had never seen an aphasic before in my life. And they didn't refer to our stroke patients as aphasics or as stroke patients. They referred to them as hemiplegics. And that's an interesting thought, in fact. And the word stroke at the time was a very, very loaded, stigmatized word. You never talked about a patient having a stroke. You talked about apoplexy or an attack or a cerebrovascular accident, but the word stroke was a very dirty word, the way cancer has been for so many years. In fact, that word never came into public light until Eisenhower had a stroke in 1956. And then Dr. Rusk's right arm, Jack Taylor, who did most of Dr. Rusk's journalist writings, wrote an article about aphasia that was on the front page of the Times, because Eisenhower had a very mild aphasia in the first few weeks. And he used the word stroke. The word stroke had never appeared in press, as far as I know. I've looked for it before that, and it wasn't even used in Wetman's book. Wetman's book doesn't mean a thing to you, but in my day, the only books that were around were Recovery from Aphasia by Joseph Wetman, who's a psychologist at the University of Chicago, and who had just had an experience in an Army hospital. And the word stroke is not in that book at all. And the other person whose book was around was Hildred Schul, Aphasia in Adults, but that was a few years later, actually. And then John Eisenson also had some work that was out there. They also had the 3 measures, the Schul, the Halstead-Wetman aphasia test, and the Eisenson. test, I forget what it was called, examining for aphasia. And that was it. There wasn't anything else out there at all. Well, Dr. Rusk wanted to bring in stroke patients, even though that was not practice at the time. And he started by bringing in a few, and our program was very, very small. I mean, I was it for a year or so, and then little by little we added some staff. But it was still a very, very small program. And over time, before long, after maybe 2 or 3 years, they comprised most of the caseload. And it was becoming clear that that was going to be the primary population. I must say, I never dreamed then that I would be sitting here today talking about this, but anyway, that's another issue. I decided to get a master's degree, and I did in about 4 years later, by going to school at night, because I was working full-time. And I got it in psychology, and I think that may have colored the rest of my career. In fact, I know it did. And then, just to give you a larger picture of where I went academically, I intended to get a Ph.D., and I had been hanging around with some people at the Haskins Labs because I was very interested in acoustic science and in speech science. And I decided to do a Ph.D. in speech science. I went to Dr. Rusk to tell him that I was going to do a Ph.D. and I would need some time off during the week. And I applied at NYU, and I was turned down because I was tenured faculty in the School of Medicine, and no tenured person with a professorial rank or higher is allowed to do a doctorate. And I was aghast. I asked Dr. Rusk to intervene for me, and he was unsuccessful, so I would have to go somewhere else. I couldn't go to the schools in the neighborhood, so to speak, because those were my students who were running those programs. That was a little bit uncomfortable. And so I decided to go to Temple University, and I went there 2 afternoons a week, finished all the coursework, and was ready to move on, and then I got pregnant. And that was the end of that. And I never went back to finish. I couldn't. My life became very complicated between having a child and still working full-time. So, enough.
I think you've given us a real flavor of how the world has changed and some of the things that have transpired over the course of your illustrious career. I mean, it's just kind of amazing to think about all of the I'm shocked to find that the membership of ASHA was 1,100 when you started. I'm wondering if we could maybe switch gears a little bit and talk about what are your central beliefs about aphasia treatment and what's effective.
I've run the gamut. I've tried everything like everybody else, everything from programmed instruction to behavioral modification to, I've done it all. We've done it all. I'm convinced that the only approach to the person with aphasia that makes any sense at all to me is a very full, I will call it a psychosocial approach for lack of any other term at the moment until we come up with a better label for it. I'm absolutely convinced that it's the only way to make life wonderful and full and rich for a person with aphasia. I also feel that unless we look at ourselves a little bit more closely and understand who we are, not just as professionals, but as human beings, it's impossible to really do a good job with someone who's aphasic. I think it takes a tremendous human element. I think one has to understand life and have a feeling for what life's all about, and that life is different for each person. And I think the uniqueness of the individual must be remembered always, each individual being a very unique human being. That gets lost as we work together because we have to work in large numbers. But I think the master clinician, the really powerful clinician who gets successful results, is the one who can remain attached and engaged by those philosophical underpinnings.
I wish I'd said that. I mean, there's nothing in what Martha has said that I disagree with. But where I struggle with this, and I'd like to know how you come out on this, is how do you fit those principles and beliefs into the current, at least in the United States, the current healthcare climate that so severely limits what we have time and what we can really get done.
This may explain why I've done a few things in the last 2 or 3 decades that focus much more on the community and on not individual treatments as much as philosophical and ethical activity. I think we need to think much harder and be more productive in our community outreach, which is very, very limited. The National Aphasia Association, which I founded 20 years ago, must have been a reaction on my part to the terrible lack of community opportunities that people with aphasia have. And in addition, I notice as I look back in my CV, so much of what I've done has been focused on materials and educational instruction for patients and families. And I must have had that in my mind a long time ago, long before this current horrible healthcare trend that we're in at the moment. Because in 1952, believe it or not, I put together a book for patients to take home that had flashcards in it and pictures and instructions on what the family could do. So I must have had I also was running a family group in 1952. And so I must have had that sense all along. It wasn't that new to me, but as things have gotten worse, and they really are impossible right now, I find myself doing more of that. We're developing programs for families and developing more and more groups that patients can come to without paying fees. The NAA has become a very powerful tool around the country, both with regional groups and with opportunities for looking on the website and getting all sorts of access to resources. And I think that's where we must go, is to simply provide as many resources as we possibly can. We don't see patients more than about 2 or 3 weeks now, if we're lucky, as inpatients. They're in a state of shock when they get there. They've just had a stroke a few days before. They're numb, they're overwhelmed. They can't really listen to information at that point. We wish we could get them back 6 months later and tell them some of the same things that we would need to tell them in the beginning. But we're focusing much more on that educational piece of our role in those early days, even in the acute phase, finding it essential, because otherwise they will have nothing. And we make sure that they know how to access certain websites and how to find certain materials and resources in their communities.
We're running out of time, and I have a couple of questions that I really would love to hear your answers to. And the first one is, if you ran the universe, if you just ran the universe of the profession of speech-language pathology, what would you have people do next? What would you have people work toward?
I would hope that all of the exchange that we've engaged in the last 2 days, which has been very intense and very enriching and very inspiring, thanks to Aura and her team, and to the wonderful people who are here participating. I would hope that all of us would really do everything possible to further what we've talked about, to make research accessible to speech pathologists all over the world, but also to use this as a jumping off point from which we can begin to influence policy, healthcare policy in particular. I think we need to find out how to do that, each in our own particular cultural climate. We each have a different culture totally, depending on where we live and who we are. I think we have an obligation to make sure that we make sure that our public officers and public servants know what aphasia is, know what the best answers are for people with aphasia, and do everything possible to provide that in every way possible. And this is why some of the smaller centers that have been developed in the last few years are terribly important to this movement. Centers like the Adler Aphasia Center, for example, as an example, and others, and community groups all over the country are making a real impact, I think, and hopefully it'll get to the public servants.
And one last question. I just can't resist this. What's your most cherished professional moment, memory?
It's an unfair question.
I know it isn't.
I think if you asked me what made me feel the proudest, is that what sort of you're asking?
However you interpret it.
I am very proud of my career. It's been so rich. It's been also a time of personal growth. It has affected me as a person enormously from the beginning. I was raised with the idea that you must give back to society and that you owe to your fellow, your brothers and sisters, anything that you can give. And so I feel very good about that. I have been giving throughout this professional life of mine, but it's also affected me personally enormously. I have an entirely different view of life, and I've matured. I mean, not just physically, but matured philosophically in particular. It's just had a tremendous effect on me, and continues to have. That doesn't change. I also feel strongly that we learn from the patients primarily. Every patient is another lesson, another universe of information. And without that, I don't think our work can move forward. If you ask me what my proudest thing is, or the thing that thrilled me the most, it's probably having received that doctorate in Doctor of Medicine honorary in Sweden in 1982. It was really, really thrilling.
I've got to sort of throw an answer in here too, because when I looked at the questions that I wrote, that was the one that really threw me the most, and that's why I'm really delighted to hear it was a hard question, because I can't answer it. It's hard, very hard. But from my own perspective, I think it's that I was, I don't know, uninformed enough, crazy enough, whatever, to have blundered into this profession as a whole. And I don't know that I can, like you, find a whole lot of particular moments that really stand out, because I just feel so lucky to be a part of this world. And for me, I agree, it was a total accident. Mm-hmm. And I almost envy some of you who might have a clear career path.
Yes,
so that you knew a long time ago, and you didn't have to look back and say, wow, that was a really cool decision I happened on. So, it's a really hard question, and I love it that you can, I love being able to share your answer with you. So that's going to be the end of our questions, but we have a few minutes, Aura?
Yeah, just very few.
Like, I saw 2 hands go up. It looks like 10. You probably mean 5, right? Okay.
5 minutes.
5, okay. Go. Yes.
I have a question. Trying to get the word aphasia.
Yeah.
Trying to get the word aphasia out to the public. I know that the National Aphasia Association has been looking for a spokesperson. Mm-hmm. Don't you think that that's what we need? Bob Woodruff is speaking for the Brain Injury Association of America now. He's their spokesperson. Can we find one?
So far, no. So far, we haven't found one. It's on our minds all the time. Yeah. And we ask everybody to help us find that person. That would be the answer to a prayer, really.
In a way. In another way, it's a real horns of a dilemma, because you're wishing a terrible fate to somebody, and it gets really, but yes, it has to be on all, we have to keep looking for those people, but it has a dark side as well. Yes.
I didn't hear.
What quality of life measures are you using?
Oh,
Well, the one that I'm using is the functional life scale, which my husband and I developed 1,000 years ago, 1973. And it's a scale that has 7 or 8 domains: social, cognitive, ADL, motor, and these are rated, and they're also qualified by certain parameters of performance, that is speed, efficiency, initiating the behavior. I forget what else, frequency, speed, efficiency, and something else. In any case, it's one that we're very accustomed to, we use a lot.
And for me, I think there are a variety of measures. One that comes to mind initially, of course, is the ASHA QCL, Quality of Life Scale, for Communicative Life Scale and Aphasia. I think this is a wide open field, and I think there is the need for, there's a lot of good work in quality of life going on everywhere, and one of the important things is to develop some really the kind of scale that will really help people convince legislators, third-party payers, etc., that it really shows the important aspects of change over time. So I think that's I think there will still be some better measures coming down the pipe.
mm-hmm. Agree.
Other questions?
Could you talk about whether you think there's a moral imperative or not to consider how we combine different approaches to aphasia area?
How we apply what?
How we combine different approaches.
Combine.
Want me to go first?
Try that.
Yeah, okay. I'll go first. Okay. It seems to me that there's a moral imperative to do that. I mean, I don't know that I can ever come to grips with what are the special needs or the special concerns for the people with whom I work. I do know that the social picture is very big, but this in no way precludes me from thinking that it's just as important to work with some of the problems people recognize in their own lives that probably have a more linguistic as opposed to a psychosocial relevance. So for me, it's the moral imperative probably starts with listening to what the patient and the patient's family, the person with aphasia and his family, really state as their true needs. So that's an important imperative for me.
Yeah, I second what you said completely. I also would add that we ought not to think of ourselves as so incredibly miraculous that we can work miracles with patients, because we can't. And we really need to turn to some other fields that are around us, that are sometimes part of a rehabilitation team. There's a lot to be drawn from literature from other areas that we've not really begun to look at systematically. Right. And I think that needs to be done. And then apply it to our work with people with aphasia. Thank you for that question.
Cora is telling us that our time is up.
Okay.
Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you, Audrey. Job well done. Well done.